There's an aspect of our daily lives that many people find challenging, and it's not a simple story. It's something that that we all have to stop and think about, and that is, how do we bring the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu into our practical existence? Meaning, how do we we have an animamin. We know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who is asa oseh v'yaseh l'chol ha'ma'asim. That we have that awareness as a knowledge, but translating that into our lives is difficult. And that's because there's a constant message that comes in from the non-Jewish or from the secular world that turns HaKadosh Baruch Hu into a bit of a theory. And it's not practical. And as a result, the tefillah is not a real conversation. We're not really feeling that we're speaking to the Ribono Shel Olam. There's just many things that are missing when we try to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we haven't yet internalized Hashem's involvement. And as I said, the more secular a person gets, the more theoretical the Ribono Shel Olam gets, to the point where there are people who would even talk about Hashem as, the master of nature, or the whatever silliness. It's not an involvement with Hashem. And the way that we are meant to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is on a much more personal level than on the theoretical level. And that has become a big challenge in the modern world. And one of the antidotes to that is Hashgacha. So I just wanted to bring up a couple of thoughts that I noticed in Rav Yerucham Levovitz, but they're really compelling thoughts that if you stopped and thought about them, you would probably recognize them as well. The first thought is about the Rashi. Rashi tells us that when Eshes Potiphar made a whole stink about Yosef HaTzadik, it created a big stink in Mitzrayim. That's what happened. People started, because people wag their tongues, and people started speaking derogatory things about Yosef HaTzadik. It became the talk of the town, was this stink about Yosef HaTzadik. So Rashi says that because they were all talking about Yosef HaTzadik, Viyehi achar hadvarim האלה, Devarim, Rashi says, is diburim. There was talk. Hashem caused the incident of the Sar HaMashkim and the Sar HaOfim to happen. So the Sar HaMashkim and the Sar HaOfim they trip up in their work. These are very high officials in Paro's cabinet. They trip up. They end up getting thrown into jail. And everyone is now talking about them. That's what Rashi says. That in order to spare Yosef HaTzadik from the slander and libel that was being chatted about him, Hashem caused this incident to happen with the Saramashkim and the Saraofim. So now they were the talk of the town, and people stopped talking about Yosef. Yosef was yesterday's news, and today's news is about the Saramashkim and the Saraofim. What Rabbi Yerucham points out, and I think that it's obvious and compelling, is that every piece of news that happens in the world that we read about, every piece of news is being directed by Shamayim to bring about a particular outcome. So a missile is sent from Yemen to Israel, and it is spoken about, whereas other things don't get so much coverage. They are not spoken about. Just an outrageous example is that the world is talking about the fact that the students in Gaza didn't start school. Not one word of the fact of all of these children from the north and from the south who have to scramble to find some sort of school setting. Not a word. That got pirsum, and this does not get pirsum. Says Rashi, and Rabbi Yerucham is pointing it out, that's mechuvan. That is intentional. In Shamayim, what gets what gets front page coverage is intentional. And it's part of the way that we're meant to see the Yad Hashem in the world in order to bring Hashem more directly into our lives. The direct engagement with Hashem comes from the fact that he is orchestrating not just the events in the world, but he's orchestrating which events are getting coverage, which events are being spoken about. And people all know that undercover operations, they always take advantage of the Super Bowl, because they know that the Super Bowl is going to get a lot of coverage, or the election season, they're going to get a lot of coverage. And so they're able to carry out all of their nefarious deeds because they know that this is getting coverage and this is not. What Rashi is coming to show us, says Rabbi Yerucham, is that that's exactly part of the Hashgacha. Part of the Hashgacha is what gets covered and what does not get covered is all mechuvan to bring about a particular end, a particular message, a particular ratzon shamayim. So that's the first thought, is that every time you see something in the news, Hashem is causing this to make it to the news because he has a plan for this. And the plan might be to distract everybody's attention from something else. It could be to prepare for his subsequent intervention. Whatever the issue is, the Psuk is revealing to us that is part of Hashgachas Hashem. And so, if you want to bring Hashem into your life a little bit more closely, and you also don't want to stop listening to the news, a way to do that is by noticing, look at that event, among the millions and millions of events that are happening, some of them very significant, that are not getting covered because of this story, because that's part of the Hashgacha, and a person is meant to recognize Hashem's hand in his life so that Hashem stops being a theory. He's actually the one governing everything down to the tiny details, and one of those tiny details is what gets covered and what does not. That's the first thought from Rav Yerucham. The second thought has to do with the Psuk where Hashem announces that he is going to distinguish between Klal Yisrael and the Egyptians, Eretz Goshen is going to be protected from the Makkah. In this case, we're talking about Makkah's Bechoros. And the Pasuk adds another ingredient, a rationale. Leman Teda ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz. What does that mean? That means, says the Rav Yerucham, that is Hashgacha. Shekasher ro'im hanhaga mechuvenet, sheha'onesh magia le'echad, ve'hasheni nechlatz mimenu, zehu hanikra Hashgachas Hashem, ve'zehu inyan ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz. That's what we're meant to know. The Makos had a very strong emphasis on individual hashgacha. So, for example, two people could be sitting in the same room, and we would have assumed that whatever light there is in that room is lighting the scene for both of the people sitting in the room. That's what we would typically assume. We would not assume that light is being separately created so that the first person can see, and so separately that the second person can see. We wouldn't typically assume that. But when it came time for Choshech, those who were not afflicted by the Makkah were walking through the same room in broad daylight, while the others who are in the room are in pitch dark, absolute absence of any light. The message is that Hashgacha is when there's differentiation. If there's an event that happens to a klal, to a whole group of people, so you don't see as much Hashgacha as you see when there is differentiation. So differentiation is a very common theme, certainly one that we look at as children of survivors, as grandchildren of survivors. We certainly make reference to the fact that some did and some did not. That itself is part of Hashgacha, so that events that are happening to a klal, but not to the whole klal. So these soldiers are in a different situation than these soldiers. And this group is in a different situation than this group. And these individuals emerge from this terrible catastrophe. They emerge with either their lives or their bodies intact, and the others not. And you say, what am I supposed to take from there? And the answer is, what you're supposed to take from there is that there's Hashgachas Hashem. And always push away from any of the messages of randomness, and always push towards a recognition that when I'm dealing with a Kadosh Baruch Hu, that's not a theory. Kadosh Baruch Hu is not a theory. Kadosh Baruch Hu is practical and involved in our lives. And the Rashi adds an interesting comment to those words. And he says, Af al pi sheshechinosi bashamayim, even though Hashem says, my Shechina is above, Gzeirasi miskayemes betachtonim. My Gzeira is fulfilled down below. And he goes on to explain that this is what is alluded to over and again in the psukim. Hashamayim kis'i, v'ha'aretz hadom raglai. Hashem b'shamayim hichin kis'o, u'malchuso b'kol mashala. It couldn't be more inyana diyoma to talk about the fact that there are two aspects of the divinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. One is Malchus Hashem in the essence of Malchus. That is Bashamayim, that there's nothing in creation, nothing in the world that is not HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Ratzon. that is Hashem Bashamayim Hechin Kiso. The Kisei is considered, that's the Malchus, but there's another Malchus. The another Malchus is Hashgacha. The fact that his will is being expressed in our lives in a mechuvan way, in a very specific, that there's no random, and the more a person recognizes the Yad Hashem, the more his life is filled with Hashgacha Pratis. That, by the way, is a correlation. Our belief in Hashgacha Pratis causes our lives to be led and directed with more Hashgacha Pratis, and that's why people at the extremes of Hashgacha Pratis are able to dictate the terms of their existence, even to the point of telling vinegar to burn. And people who are not thinking about Hashgacha Pratis, at the other end of the spectrum, their lives appear as though they are subject to Hashgacha Klolis, as though they're subject to, well, this is what happened to everyone. And since it happened to everyone, it happened to this person as well. That is a function of a person's emunah, as a person becomes more engaged with Hashgacha Pratis. So that is called the Malchus here. And that is what Umalchuso Bakal Mashallah refers to. That is V'ha'aretz Hadom Raglai. And that is what Rashi is alluding to when he says, even though my Shechina is above, my Gzeros are miskayemes b'tachtonim. What I have determined and dictated is what becomes relevant, and it plays out in the world below, because he is the Shalit and the Mashgiach b'kerev ha'aretz. So I thought that these two ideas would be useful to try to counter the message of Hashem in the theory. We have to get Hashem away from theory into our practice, into our lives. We say an animamin be'emuna shalema, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the borei umanhig, asa oseh v'yaseh l'chol hama'asim. Everything that's happening in our lives is his doing. We have free choice, and that free choice has to do with our internal allegiance to him, with our choice to relate to him and to serve him. But everything that happens, everything that plays out, everything that happens is all his hashgacha. And the message that it's somehow theoretical must be countered by practice. Now, it's hard, because millions of things in our lives work and happen, and they seem to work and happen by themselves, or they seem to work and happen with natural causality. So there's a huge challenge when you're also hearing messages that Hashem is a theory, and you're also in your practical daily life, things are cause and effect in a seemingly very patterned way, to be able to go back and reaffirm the connection to Hashem on a practical level. For that, you have a couple of these examples where Hashgacha can provide the counterweight to the incoming message. Hashgacha, where things are not universal, not everybody gets affected, not everybody got corona, not everybody had to do this, not everybody was impacted this way. And the fact that what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does, his Malchus, is expressed in this world as well. That his Malchus is expressed as the Hashgacha HaMechuvenes in our lives.